I know I made bad decisions, a lot of bad decisions, a lot of bad judgments.
That he had been unfaithful to her. David took Adrienne behind an elementary school, and apparently some clothes came off. She went nuts. She banged her head against the floor, and she kept yelling, "Kill her, kill her, kill her."
It was extremely frustrating. You know, you want to know what happened, and nobody is talking to you. Nobody's answering your questions.
Diane let the word out to her roommates that, in fact, she had killed somebody.
But I did wish her dead at one point.
If you loved me, you would kill her. These chilling words, spoken by Diane Zamora to her boyfriend David Graham, would set in motion a tragic chain of events that no one could have predicted. What could drive a young woman, destined for a prestigious future, to demand such an unthinkable act? The answer lies in a love that spiraled into jealousy, obsession, and ultimately murder. It all started with a simple affair. David, the promising Air Force cadet, confessed to a brief fling with 16-year-old Adrienne Jones, an innocent high school student who had no idea she was walking into the center of a deadly love triangle. But Diane couldn't bear the betrayal. Her world, built on the foundation of a perfect relationship, was shattered. So she gave David an ultimatum. To prove his love, Adrienne had to die. How far would someone go to erase a mistake and salvage their pride? And what happens when love becomes so twisted that murder feels like the only way out? But before we dive deeper into the mystery, I'd like to ask for a small favor. The statistics show that more than 70% of you watching aren't subscribed to the channel yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into true crime and want to stay updated on future cases, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and ensures you don't miss out on any new videos. Now, without further ado, let's get back to the case. Diane Zamora and David Graham's relationship began innocently enough in high school in Texas, where they quickly formed a bond that seemed inseparable. At first glance, they were the quintessential high school sweethearts, both exceptional students, driven by ambition, with seemingly limitless futures ahead of them. Zamora, a bright student from Crowley High School, was recognized for her academic excellence. She carried herself with the discipline and focus that would eventually lead her to a prestigious path at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. Graham, on the other hand, was a star athlete, known for his achievements in cross-country and track events, a rising star at Mansfield High School. His dream of becoming an Air Force pilot was well within his reach, as he later secured a spot at the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. Their romance, however, quickly took on a life of its own. What began as an innocent high school relationship soon escalated into what many around them described as an all-consuming, obsessive connection. Those close to the couple couldn't help but notice the intensity with which they clung to one another, shutting out the world and focusing solely on their shared future. They were no ordinary teenage couple making vague plans for the future. No, David and Diane meticulously plotted out every detail of their lives together. They would marry, conquer the challenges of military life, and spend the rest of their lives side by side. Their devotion was absolute, at least. That's how it appeared on the surface. But as is often the case with such intense relationships, cracks began to appear. Could this seemingly perfect couple truly stand the test of time, or was their obsessive love hiding something far darker? In late November 1995, that question was answered when Graham made a startling confession that would forever alter the course of their lives. He admitted to Diane that he had been unfaithful, having had a brief sexual encounter with another high school student, 16-year-old Adrienne Jones. It had happened after a cross-country meet, a fleeting moment, but one that would set off a catastrophic chain of events. Adrienne Jones was, by all accounts, a bright and promising young girl. She attended Mansfield High School, the same school as Graham, and was well known for her friendly demeanor and outgoing personality. Like Graham, Adrian excelled in athletics, participating in the school's track and field team. She was the kind of person who easily made friends, her warm smile masking any hint of the tragic fate that awaited her. How could such a vibrant, well-liked young girl become the target of such a vicious and calculated act? For Diane, hearing about Graham's infidelity was like a dagger to the heart. She had built her world around him, and in one brief moment, he had destroyed the purity of their relationship. This wasn't just about jealousy, it was about betrayal on a deeply emotional level. Diane had convinced herself that their love was sacred, untouchable, and any blemish upon it had to be erased. But how far would she go to restore what she believed was her perfect relationship? Zamora demanded the unthinkable. Graham had to prove his love for her by taking Adrian's life. It was a terrifying ultimatum, but one that would seal the fate of all three. Diane believed that by erasing Adrian, she could also erase the betrayal, and in some twisted way, cleanse their relationship of its sins. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming control over her world. And Graham, torn between guilt and his own emotional manipulation, agreed. How far would he go to prove his love? Together, they meticulously planned Adrian's murder, detailing each step with the kind of precision that only deep-seated obsession could fuel. Every action was coldly calculated, from the moment Graham would call Adrian to lure her out, to the exact location where her life would end. On the evening of December 3rd, 1995, their plan, this horrifying act of jealousy, began to unfold. Graham called Adrian, pretending it was just a casual meetup. To Adrian, this seemed like an innocent gesture. After all, she had no reason to suspect anything sinister. How could she have known that agreeing to meet him would be the last decision she would ever make? Graham picked her up late at night, and the two drove toward a remote, isolated area near Joe Pool Lake in Grand Prairie, Texas. The quiet, secluded surroundings would become the stage for a brutal, premeditated act of violence. But what Adrian didn't know was that Diane Zamora was hiding in the trunk of the car, waiting for the right moment to ambush her. The coldness of the plan was bone-chilling as Zamora's fury simmered in the dark. Every passing second brought them closer to the deadly confrontation, her mind undoubtedly racing with thoughts of revenge, jealousy, and the twisted belief that this act would somehow fix everything. What could have been going through Adrian's mind as they arrived at the remote location? Did she sense any danger? If she did, it was too late. The moment they arrived, Zamora crawled out of the trunk, like a predator emerging from the shadows, and confronted Adrian. What followed was a brutal and horrifying attack. Graham attempted to break Adrian's neck, perhaps a desperate bid to end things quickly, but when that failed, Zamora took matters into her own hands, striking Adrian multiple times on the head with a dumbbell. Adrian fought back, even in her weakened state. Her will to survive was strong, but was it enough to escape this deadly trap? Despite her injuries, she somehow managed to break free and escape the car, running for her life. However, her fight for survival wasn't over. Severely wounded and bleeding, Adrian ran into the darkness, but Graham wasn't about to let her get away. The scene must have been horrifying, an innocent teenage girl running, injured and terrified, while her killers pursued her. Graham followed her, this time armed with a 9mm pistol. With no hesitation and in cold blood, he caught up to her and shot her twice, once in the cheek and once in the head. The gunshots rang out into the night, sealing her fate. Adrienne Jones, a bright, promising young girl, lay dead on the side of a lonely road, her body abandoned behind a barbed wire fence. Graham and Zamora fled the scene, leaving the horror they had inflicted behind them, as if they could escape the consequences of their actions. This heinous act, driven by jealousy and manipulation, shocked the local community, particularly because of the seemingly bright futures both Zamora and Graham had ahead of them. What was once a relationship of promise had now become a deadly obsession that ended with the tragic loss of a young life. Following the murder, they both returned to their regular lives as if nothing had happened. Could you imagine carrying on with life, going to school, making plans for the future, all while knowing you had just taken part in an unspeakable crime? The chilling part was how seamlessly they seemed to blend back into their routines. For months, they lived without a hint of remorse, confident that their heinous act would go unnoticed. But while they were moving forward with their lives, the family and friends of Adrienne Jones were left grappling with a devastating loss, a wound that would remain open for months. Adrienne's body was discovered the very next morning on December 4th, 1995, by a farmer making his way along a remote country road. The discovery must have been shocking. A young girl's body, brutally beaten and shot, discarded like she was nothing more than garbage. She had been left behind a barbed wire fence, her once vibrant life now reduced to a lifeless form, marred by the violence that ended it. Beaten and shot twice, once in the cheek and once in the head, the brutality of her murder was impossible to ignore. The small Texas community was left reeling. Who could have done this to such a promising young girl? Adrienne was well liked, a talented student with no known enemies. Her friends and family were heartbroken, unable to comprehend how something so tragic could happen to someone so full of life. Investigators were equally perplexed. The lack of clear evidence, combined with Adrienne's positive reputation, made the case particularly challenging. Interviews with classmates, friends, and acquaintances yielded no significant leads. For a while, it seemed as though Adrienne's murder might never be solved. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the case grew cold. How could such a violent, horrific crime remain a mystery? The community was haunted by the thought that a killer was still out there, walking free. Hundreds of people were interviewed, countless theories were explored, but nothing substantial surfaced. Adrienne's murder, once a major shock, slowly faded into the background as hope for justice dwindled. The case stalled, frozen in time, with Adrienne's family left to suffer in silence, wondering if they would ever know the truth. Then, nearly 9 months after the murder, something completely unexpected happened. The break investigators had been waiting for came not from a brilliant piece of detective work, but from a casual conversation. Diane Zamora, now a cadet at the prestigious U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, had started talking about the murder. But why would she talk about it, and in such a reckless way? During what appeared to be harmless conversations about relationships, Zamora made a shocking revelation. She bragged to her fellow cadets that her boyfriend, David Graham, had killed someone to prove his love for her. Can you imagine the weight of those words? The audacity of casually admitting to such a horrific crime in the midst of everyday conversations? For her, it was almost as if this murder had become a twisted badge of honor, a symbol of her control over Graham and their obsessive bond. Her words, though meant to impress or shock her peers, instead set off a chain of events that would lead to her downfall. Zamora's fellow cadets were horrified. What kind of person would confess to something so sinister? Realizing the gravity of the situation, they reported her comments to their superiors at the academy, who wasted no time contacting law enforcement officials in Texas. Suddenly, after months of frustration and dead ends, the investigation into Adrienne Jones's murder gained new momentum. What could have driven Zamora to reveal such a dark secret? Was it arrogance, guilt, or a desire to share the twisted nature of her relationship with Graham? Whatever the reason, her confession was a turning point in the case, unraveling the carefully crafted facade that she and Graham had maintained for nearly a year. The truth, once buried deep, was finally starting to come to light. Suffice to say, the naval authorities wasted no time after hearing Zamora's chilling confession. They quickly contacted the police in Texas, a decision that set the wheels of justice back in motion. After months of dead ends, this was the breakthrough the investigators had been waiting for. Officers were dispatched to Annapolis, Maryland, where they would come face to face with Diane Zamora, the girl at the center of a murder that had baffled the community for nearly a year. When the investigators sat down with Zamora, she initially tried to downplay her earlier confession. Could it all have been a lie? A misguided attempt to impress her roommates, as she claimed? According to Zamora, the entire story had been a fabrication, a wild tale concocted to gain attention and perhaps even admiration from her fellow cadets. At first, it seemed like she might stick to that story, maintaining a fragile layer of denial in the face of mounting pressure. But the investigators were not convinced. As the interrogation wore on, it became clear that Zamora's story was falling apart. The weight of the truth, buried for so long, was finally cracking her facade. Piece by piece, under the relentless pressure of questioning, her resolve crumbled. Slowly she began to reveal the horrifying truth. It hadn't been a lie. She and David Graham had indeed planned and executed the murder of Adrienne Jones. But why would two bright, ambitious young people go to such terrifying lengths? Zamora explained their motivations, driven by jealousy, anger, and a twisted sense of loyalty. She detailed how she had been the one to push for the murder, insisting that Graham prove his love for her by eliminating Adrienne. She admitted that they had carefully planned the attack, their youthful obsession turning into something far darker and more dangerous. Meanwhile, in Colorado Springs, David Graham was also facing pressure from the authorities. Unlike Zamora, Graham had been operating in the structured, regimented world of the U.S. Air Force Academy, but no amount of military discipline could prepare him for the intense questioning he was about to face. Investigators from both the Air Force and local police agencies took turns interrogating Graham, determined to extract the truth. Would he maintain his innocence, or would the guilt finally consume him? At first, Graham denied everything. He refused to admit his involvement, sticking to his story with the same stubbornness that had allowed him to live his life normally for the past 9 months. But the authorities had a trick up their sleeve, a polygraph test. And when Graham failed the test, the cracks in his story became impossible to ignore. With his resolve shattered, Graham did the only thing he could. He confessed. But this wasn't just any confession. It was a detailed, graphic account that left no doubt about the horror of what he and Zamora had done. Over 4 painstakingly written pages, Graham recounted the events of that night in brutal detail. He explained how he had picked up Adrienne under the pretense of a friendly meetup, playing on her trust and innocence to lure her into a deadly trap. In his confession, Graham described how he had attempted to break Adrienne's neck during the initial attack, but had failed. His chilling account continued with how Zamora had then taken over, bludgeoning Adrienne with a dumbbell in a fit of rage. Even as Adrienne tried to escape, her will to survive strong, Graham had coldly followed her and shot her twice, making sure there was no chance she would live to tell the tale. This was no accident, no moment of passion. It was premeditated murder, carefully calculated and executed with brutal precision. With both Zamora and Graham's confessions now in hand, the investigators had more than enough evidence to move forward. But they weren't done yet. Police recovered the murder weapon, the 9mm pistol Graham had used to kill Adrienne, as well as the dumbbell that had been used to inflict the initial blows. Both items were found at Graham's family home, further solidifying the case against them. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, and it painted a damning picture of 2 young lovers who had descended into madness. With this mountain of evidence, the police were able to formally charge both Diane Zamora and David Graham with capital murder. The prosecution's case was rock solid. Between the confessions, the physical evidence, and the overwhelming details of the crime, they were confident they could secure a conviction. But the case would not be as straightforward as it seemed. What happens when the people responsible for a crime so heinous turn on each other in a desperate bid to save themselves? As the trial preparations began, it became clear that both Zamora and Graham were no longer the inseparable couple they had once been. The very bond that had fueled the murder was now fracturing, as each tried to shift the blame onto the other. Diane would claim that Graham had been the mastermind, manipulating her into going along with the plan. Graham, on the other hand, would argue that it was Zamora who had demanded Adrian's death, coercing him into the act. Their love had once driven them to commit an unspeakable crime. Now, that same love was unraveling in the courtroom, as they fought to escape the consequences of their actions. But no matter how much they tried to point fingers, the truth was undeniable. Both had played a part in the death of Adrian Jones, and neither would walk away unscathed. Zamora's trial began on February 2, 1998, at the Tarrant County Courthouse in Fort Worth, Texas. The prosecution portrayed her as a jealous and controlling girlfriend who demanded that Graham murder Adrian Jones to redeem himself after his brief sexual encounter with her. The state argued that Zamora's obsession with Graham, combined with her fury over the betrayal, had led her to orchestrate the brutal killing of an innocent young girl. The trial was dramatic, with Zamora taking the stand in her own defense. She claimed that while she had been present at the murder scene, she had no intention of killing Adrian. She alleged that Graham had manipulated her and that she had been a passive participant, only helping to cover up the crime out of fear. Zamora tried to paint Graham as the dominant figure in their relationship, blaming him for the planning and execution of the murder. However, the prosecution was able to counter Zamora's defense with powerful testimony from her former Naval Academy roommates. One of her roommates, Jennifer McKerney, testified that Zamora had confessed to the murder, stating that Adrienne deserved to die because she was a tramp and a slut. This testimony, combined with Zamora's own confession to the authorities, severely damaged her credibility in front of the jury. Despite her emotional testimony and attempts to shift blame onto Graham, the jury was not convinced. On February 17, 1998, Zamora was found guilty of capital murder. Though the prosecution had initially sought the death penalty, Adrian's mother, Linda Jones, pleaded for a life sentence instead, expressing that she did not want to see another life lost. Zamora was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. She remains incarcerated and will be eligible for parole in 2036. David Graham's trial. Following Zamora's conviction, David Graham's trial commenced in July 1998. The prosecution in Graham's trial built a similar case, arguing that Graham had acted on Zamora's demands to prove his love by killing Adrian Jones. While Graham had initially confessed to his role in the murder during the trial, he attempted to distance himself from the crime by claiming that he had only acted under Zamora's influence. He painted Zamora as a manipulative and domineering figure who had coerced him into participating in the murder. Graham's defense team attempted to argue that Zamora had been the true mastermind behind the plot, with Graham merely carrying out her instructions. However, like Zamora, Graham's efforts to shift the blame were unsuccessful. His initial confessions, coupled with the overwhelming physical evidence, including the murder weapon found at his father's house, left the jury little room for doubt. On July 24, 1998, Graham was also found guilty of capital murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years, the same sentence as Zamora. Graham, like Zamora, will be eligible for parole in 2036. Following their convictions, both Diane Zamora and David Graham were sent to separate prisons in Texas to serve their life sentences. Their incarceration marked the end of a tumultuous and tragic story that had captivated the public for years. However, life behind bars brought further developments for both individuals. Diane Zamora was incarcerated at the Dr. Lane Murray Unit in Gatesville, Texas. Throughout the years, Zamora remained a highly publicized figure, due to both her notoriety and the high-profile nature of the case. In 2003, she married another inmate by proxy, though the relationship eventually ended in divorce. Over time, Zamora continued to insist on her innocence, claiming that her confession had been coerced and that she had not been an active participant in Adrienne Jones's murder. Zamora made several appeals and attempted to contest her conviction. In one such effort in 2018, she filed a civil rights lawsuit against Texas prison officials, claiming that she deserved to remain in protective custody due to the public attention surrounding her case. She argued that the high-profile nature of her crime made her a target within the general prison population. However, her appeals were unsuccessful, and she remains incarcerated with the possibility of parole in 2036. David Graham was sent to the James V. Allred Unit in Iowa Park, Texas, where he has remained since his conviction. Like Zamora, Graham also had a significant life change while incarcerated, marrying a woman by proxy in 2010. He has largely stayed out of the public eye, serving his sentence quietly. Despite his initial confession and conviction, Graham has, on occasion, expressed regret and claimed that he was influenced by Zamora to carry out the murder. Graham's prison life has not attracted the same level of attention as Zamora's, though he remains a central figure in the tragic narrative of the Texas cadet murder case. Like Zamora, he will be eligible for parole in 2036, but the likelihood of either being released is uncertain given the brutality of their crime and the impact it had on the community. Both Graham and Zamora's lives have been shaped by the events of one fateful night in 1995, where jealousy, manipulation, and obsession drove them to commit an unthinkable act. The murder of Adrienne Jones continues to haunt those involved and serves as a reminder of how a seemingly ordinary teenage relationship can spiral into tragedy. Now we turn to you guys. What are your thoughts on this tragic case? Do you think Diane's ultimatum was driven solely by jealousy, or was there a deeper psychological issue at play? Could David have stopped this spiral into darkness, or was he too blinded by his obsession with Diane? And do you believe that either of them truly feels remorse for what they've done? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into cases where love and betrayal take a deadly turn. Your support helps keep this channel growing and allows us to continue bringing you these gripping stories.